G'day, and welcome to the AHDC podcast series, Health Design on the Go. I'm your host, David Cummins, and today we're speaking to Matthew Manos, who is the founder of Very Nice, which has been operating for almost 15 years. Very Nice is a design strategy practice that specialises in brand strategy, experience design, and strategic foresight. Matthew is an assistant professor of design strategy at the University of Southern California. Matthew is very interested in the world of design thinking and have recently been focusing more on the world of health and healthcare and innovation, which is why he's the perfect guest today to discuss the art of consulting in health design. Welcome, Matthew. Thank you for your time.
Thanks so much for having me, David. Happy to be here.
For those that don't know more about your practice, Very Nice, can you just explain to a few people what Very Nice is and what you exactly do?
Yeah, absolutely. So Very Nice is a design strategy consultancy. And what that really means, and when we think about design strategy, we're really referring to the art of figuring out what needs to even be designed. That's the way that we think about it. So this can include a lot of listening, which we'll talk about today, research with users, thinking about the market and what are the openings for various brands to position themselves and create unique value. But I think what's really interesting about Very Nice is since day one, we've had this model and this commitment to give half of our work away for free to nonprofit organizations. And so to do that, we have built quite an army of volunteers that support us and that work on various projects for smaller grassroots organizations as well. And in addition to that, we work with a lot of larger organizations like the American Heart Association, Google, the United Nations, Apple, all kinds of folks on all kinds of really interesting projects as well. One thing that I would add that I bring and that Very Nice brings very much as its ethos into any of this work is a sense of creativity and innovation. A lot of that stemming from the fact that we started as a graphic design practice, actually. So we did not start as a strategy firm at all and pivoted towards that about 4 years into the business. So still fairly early in, we made that move. But I think that those creative roots really influence the way that we do our work and the way that we collaborate with our clients as well.
Yeah, design thinking is very interesting, and it's something that Australia has really only discovered certainly the last maybe 5-10 years, and you were way ahead of the curve 15 years ago with design thinking. For those of you that don't know what design thinking is, can you just explain it a little bit more simply for people to understand exactly the power of design thinking when it comes to a problem?
Yeah, absolutely. The way that I like to describe it is about building a bridge between the needs of people and the needs of business. And the way that this is really revolutionary is traditional consulting would take a side. It would take the side of business and it would say, this is the exact bottom line strategy. This is where we need to head with this product in the future. This is my idea, whatever that might be. And then they would put it out there and say, hey, users, hope you like it. And that did not lead to very inclusive innovations that are representative of people's actual needs. And I think that that is the real power of a design driven approach. Aside from that, sort of ethos wise, methodology wise, it's often referred to as this process that is divergent and then convergent. So, divergent being, hey, let's start by thinking about all kinds of ideas. There's no constraints. We can come up with anything. And then convergent being, all right, we've done that. Now let's filter based on the goals of the project. And I think that really lends itself to that creative space for ideation that just drives ideas that you don't normally see.
Yeah, I totally agree. And for me, one of the best things of design thinking is we were always taught 90% planning, 10% execution. And everyone still today goes into a solution mode when you still don't understand the problem. So I think what design thinking does is it takes you through every process to understand what the problem is. And if you really compare what you thought was the solution initially to what is the actual solution, it's very, very different. So I do think that benefit of that process is extremely powerful.
Yeah, it really challenges bias. I think what you're saying speaks to that really well. And that just is fundamentally different than the way we've thought about innovation for centuries. It's always been, oh, some genius comes up with an idea and invents it, and it's sort of in this bubble. and they just were born with this gift to be able to come up with this idea. And I think what I love about design is it's all about people, and it's all about involving people in that process. And eventually businesses have really woken up to the fact that that's not just a nice thing to do. It's something that actually is taking your customers along. They're the ones that are going to be purchasing these products, using these services. Why wouldn't you want to do that, right? To me, that is especially important in healthcare, which I know is the space that you're working in. That is such a people oriented space as well.
Yeah, I think we've all been in rooms where you find someone of authority and they go straight into solution mode and everyone agrees to it without any thinking. And then not all the times is it a positive outcome, but I would say with design thinking process, you're pretty much on the money most of the time, which I think just gives you that little bit of extra time to understand the problem to get a better result in the end. So, in reference to design thinking, I would say as well, with the research I've read of yours, there's actually a lot of leadership principles there, such as empathy, listening, understanding, removing ego, collaboration. So, I find your research quite interesting in the sense that you've actually used design thinking principles and leadership principles and put them together for the benefit of healthcare. Do you mind just talking a bit more about your leadership principles in reference to consulting?
Yeah, of course. I think that the leadership principles with consulting are actually quite aligned just with the design principles that I have, which is how can you create space for a team to thrive, be themselves, which means be a bit strange, be a bit peculiar, right? That divergent phase. But then how can you also be a leader that makes it very clear what are the steps, what are the action items, what are the deliverables, and that's very much that convergent phase. I think in a lot of our work with our clients, and luckily this has not been too hard to enforce because we work with a lot of really great clients that are in the nonprofit space because they care about people and their constituents and stakeholders. But we've really tried to instill this idea of listening, and more often than not it's less about convincing an organization to listen. It's about convincing them to listen to more people. And so, how can we take major decisions around the direction of a program or initiative or of a product outside of that boardroom and actually into the streets and into a space where you can hear from the everyday people that are listening to you as well?
Yeah, and so that feeds into as well the community involvement and consumer understanding, because at the end of the day, when you've got people in an ivory tower saying this is the way to do it without actually listening to the masses, especially in healthcare, I find it quite interesting when people actually haven't asked the consumers of healthcare exactly what their needs are.
Oh, absolutely. I had a friend of mine that owned a creative agency in New York, and they had a client that was a toy company. They were coming out with a new toy, and it was geared towards young boys age 8 to 11. And the friend of mine presented the work, and the founder of that toy company said, "You know, I don't like it. I just don't react well to red," right? Something like that. And my friend, I thought this was genius and brave, said, "Well, sir, you're not an 8-year-old boy." And this is such a good example of the way that so many, especially design decisions, and when I say that in this case, I do mean visual design, it tends to really be an afterthought in terms of what will actually be most effective or most useful or most inspiring for that person. And when it comes to healthcare, and I know just a lot of technology fields as well, that can very much look like creating standards that are used across the board. And those standards are ultimately modeled after a sample of people and a sort of inkling or an interest. Those people might not be representative of the folks that are actually using these innovations as well.
Yeah, I 100% agree, especially in the world of health design, where you're actually designing a building and where you actually have sometimes minimal consultation with the patients or the visitors. And it's generally a nurse that's been there for 30 years but has no reference point in any other hospitals. So it's opposed to one person's opinion versus what is actually best practice for the greater good of the patient. So that is a common theme that I've seen throughout my career where at long-standing hospitals with long-standing staff, they choose what they want, not necessarily what the research says. So I do find that interesting, knowing that that person will one day go.
Absolutely. There was a great project that IDEO did, which is, I think, operating globally as well, where they were approached by a hospital to sort of create a new design, a new healthcare design, space design in particular, that would calm patients, especially patients of a certain category of experience that they were having health wise in the hospital. And really, all of the suggestions from the client was, could we maybe put up some plants or get a new mural or whatever that might be? And what IDEO decided to do, and this was many years ago, but I still use this as a reference, is they actually strapped a camera to their head and they say, hey, I'm going to live as that particular patient for the day. And the footage comes back, and 90% of it is of the ceiling, and they're lying down on a bed. And what is the plant in the corner of the room going to do at that point, right? And so I think that these are really good examples of where you have this good intention, these great ideas, maybe it's things you've seen before, but you're not seeing it through the correct eyes. And I think nowadays in design, it's actually evolved even more, where it's saying, how can we actually hire people who have these lived experiences similar to those who we are designing for, and actually have them be the designer as well? So all of those things are really exciting to me in terms of the ways that the design strategy consulting field has really grown up over the last almost 15 years that I've been in it.
Yeah, that's a really good example. The ceiling example is a very good one. I remember on one project I was on, the design team had put clouds in the pediatric ward. And so the kids could look at clouds. But long story short, they all thought they were in heaven because they were doped up.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. See, so that can be problematic too.
They all thought they died. So they started crying.
Wow.
But they changed the clouds with Mickey Mouse and things like that because they honestly thought they had died. So
Wow.
it's a very interesting concept to have an adult design peds without discussions with the actual end users. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, so I think that's a really good example.
A project I'd love to talk about, because there's a few projects that I've worked on that really circle this question of listening. Let's just call it co-design, being able to design with the communities that you're actually working within. There was one project that we worked on with a nonprofit here in Los Angeles called Pando Populous, and they were partnered with a number of different organizations, youth organizations in South Los Angeles, which was an area that was hit really hard during the LA riots. It's an area that is known for a certain crime rate, et cetera. But I think that the most important thing is that there is a serious amount of vacant lots in this certain neighborhood that they were interested in working in. And some of those local organizations wanted to be able to come together and improve those lots, actually put something there, activate those spaces. And so we were brought on to facilitate a workshop that involved community members, church members, members of different organizations in the process of imagining what could this space be. And so what that workshop looked like is actually people literally building models using Legos, using Play-Doh. This did not have to look fancy, just something that could actually help them communicate what they wanted to see in their own neighborhood. Because these nonprofits were based there, but not everybody involved in the decisions of what happens in these spaces will be local. You might have a developer come in and put up a giant apartment that nobody wants, or whatever it might be. And so I think that was a really good example for me, seeing the power of a more design oriented approach to even starting the process, and then watching how it can evolve from there, informed by that community. Some of that work also very much influenced by what we've done with the American Heart Association in building out a toolkit called exponential listening. And this is a toolkit that follows four different steps of question, listen, reflect, and learn. And this toolkit was built because the organization was interested in finding ways to better understand the needs of rural communities here in the United States. It's a national organization, but it operates in sort of a regional manner. They're very good at having regional relevance, but rural communities have remained a challenge to really know what are the needs, how can we best support that space. So again, with that work, we did a workshop with the community where we actually tried out a bunch of different methodologies and saw what was sticking and turned that into a toolkit that then they were able to use across the country as well. So those types of processes, you don't see enough of that in healthcare. And I say that because healthcare is all about supporting people, right? And yet, again, the people are typically the last stop on where the ideas are coming from in really truly listening to those needs.
Yeah, I always say build for the patient. Always imagine that that patient is your mother. And so if you're recruiting the builders and the design team and the consulting team to all remember that at one point that's your mother in that room, I find that's the unique selling point of healthcare versus commercial or industrial or aviation. So I always find that really important because people are at their most vulnerable. So you really have to keep that in mind that at one point in time, a loved one of yours will be in that room. So you have to really make sure, and for me, that's the driving passion and the best part about healthcare design and building. One of the biggest problems in Australia, I assume over in America as well, is a lot of our projects, we're rolling out about $30 billion worth of work in the east coast of Australia alone in the next few years. But it's generally a government promise. It's a state-based government promise that every state parliament government will be there for 4 years. So there's always this time criticality of we have to do it now. We have to win the next election. So they pretty much rush. And as I said before, it's 90% planning, 10% execution. How do we find that balance when you've got time once it's done now, and yet we've got limited time?
I get that question a lot because if you think about what a design strategist does, they're sort of professionals at making things take longer, right? Because the alternative is let's just put a meeting on the calendar, decide what to do, and do it, right? And the disturbing thing, though, is while that saves time, that can create a whole lot of problems. So, what happens when you don't design with the user? You might spend a bunch of money on something that nobody wants. It might be a very prescriptive solution, isn't inclusive, could be offensive. When you design with the user, I think that there's a lot of really obvious benefits. There's buy in. The process tends to be more documented, so it's very transparent as you go as well. But this question of duration still comes up a lot. And I think the thing that I would say to that is two things. One is silly, and I guess the other is serious. The silly thing is start sooner. I can't tell you how many projects are started and have such a fast turnaround time simply because there wasn't this ability to just start the work. There was all these conversations, all these meetings about the meetings, about the meetings, about starting the work. And all of that time could have been invested in just go out there and talk to people, right? So that's a little bit silly, but I think good advice 90% of the time, start earlier, right? I think the other advice that I would have is this doesn't have to take a long time, actually. Spending a week going into a community, having as many conversations as possible is something that you could do if that's all you have. This is a model that's scalable in terms of listening, in terms of co-designing. And sure, it could go on for months and it could have iterations and you could interview 100 people and you could do all of these things, but you also could just do a little bit, and that little bit goes a long way.
I 100% agree with everything you've just said. At the end of the day, I think that also leads into the importance of expertise in your field and actually having the ability to communicate. So, what skills and tips do you have for leaders or chairs of a certain user group or a certain practice or a certain meeting to actually enhance their listening skills, noting that that's the importance of the question?
It's a good question, and it's a big question because it's almost more of a behavior or mindset change in my mind. We've thought about that innovator as that sole innovator, that person that comes up with this idea. We live in this society where it's highly competitive. It's very much a get out of my way world, especially in the US, and I'm sure this happens in Australia as well, where the default of success isn't necessarily that person was super collaborative, right? That's not necessarily the default. I think that that's changing, but it's not the default of what the view of business success is. So, in some way, the answer to your question is we need to see a mindset shift, almost a movement where it's less about the individual role and it's more about that collaborative role, especially in these design environments. I think it honestly just starts there.
I feel as well, sometimes I've been in meetings where everyone feels they have to talk because everyone feels they have an opinion, which is great, but then you have the chair overriding things because they feel that they are the authority. But I certainly, since my leadership training, really choose to listen a lot more and take a step back. Just because I'm not talking doesn't mean I'm not listening. And just because I'm not talking doesn't mean I'm not thinking. And I personally have changed my tact a lot. And I feel that two ears, one mouth, that's sort of the way it is. I'm taking in double the information when I'm just, as opposed to speaking. So I do find listening and relaxing and removing the ego and being more empathetic to those that I'm trying to help solve the problem is a way better form of communication than just going into solution mode.
And that's really hard to do because I think a lot of the times, and it's funny because we're doing an interview right now, so I have to admit I am doing this right now. You're asking a question or you're talking, and halfway into it, I'm thinking, what am I going to say next? Right? That's what happens in these meetings. I think it is because the professional world is highly performative and it's very much around how will I show up? What will I say? To the point where people aren't truly listening versus if you're that quiet one in the room. And I actually tend to be that as well when I'm in a larger meeting. I tend to say something towards the end of the meeting. And for me, that's my way of trying to be a sponge for everything that's being said and trying to be a dot connector too and a synthesizer. And this gets me to another point or a bit of advice, both on design leadership, but also design work in general that I try to instill in my students or in any designers that I'm mentoring is a lot of the times we see the designer as the creator of something, but I think we should shift to the designer as the facilitator of the creation. And that to me is a much more powerful role. Powerful is not even the right word, just a more honest role of what we can do. We're thrown into professionally environments where we have to design for something that frankly doesn't affect us at all, right? Like we're often designing for others. That's by definition the field. So what we want or us as the creator can't matter less. And yet we have the tools and the process and the method and the mindset and we can bring people along through that and actually lean more on maybe the client or the community or whoever it is that's actually affected. I think that can make us really strong design leaders.
I 100% agree. What I have found in my career, though, there are certain architects that do listen a lot more, and there are certain architects that don't listen and try to push their own agenda. Those architects that listen a lot more seem to have better clinical outcomes in the long term versus those that try to push their own agenda because that's the way it's always been done. So I do find there is a certain decorum and a certain respect that those listening architects have that is a skill that not everyone does have, which I think a lot of architects and even any form of leadership or chair should aspire to.
Yeah, and I think again it comes back to a mindset shift where I would guess the architects that go into this with their own agenda and they try to push that, they really value the output. They really value what is going to show up in my portfolio, what is this going to look like at the end? And then the ones that value the listening, right? They really value the process. And that is actually what defines them as a creative architect, not necessarily the work that they do. That's the designer that I've become, where I'm not in love with any end solution at all. I am in love with the process and the methodology. And I do think that that shift, it's not a shift that everyone has to make. We need beautiful things. We need people that really care about that output. But I do think that that shift has made me a better designer, actually, and at least a designer that is more of a listener in that process too.
Yeah, and I think for me as well with design thinking and any form of design, the excitement comes in not knowing because there is a certain tipping point in design thinking, a certain tipping point in health design where, this makes sense because actually that last 10% is really bloody easy. Yeah, this color, it's this size, it's this need. But the problem is actually the journey, which I think as well a lot of people are starting to understand and enjoy with that collaborative approach where you actually have evidence to support your thinking and the outcome, where if you're challenged, you can actually support your arguments through research, through collaboration, through discussing the problem with the users.
Absolutely. Completely agree.
Yeah. So just before we finish up, what do you think are some of the take-home messages for people in the world of health design, people in the world of design, people who are actually designing these hospitals and creating a solution to a problem for patients in a hospital and the governments?
Yeah, gosh, and that is such an exciting project to be working on. So anybody that's listening, what a cool opportunity that you have. Again, my view, my recommendation, especially if you are working to design a hospital and you're working to, let's just admit it, right? Create a space that people do not want to be in, right? Certainly there's cases where someone enters that space and they're having the worst day of their life, right? I think that that is such an important thing to remember when designing, and it should really drive the ethos home of we need to involve people, we need to listen to people. What is scaring people about hospitals? Is it that really bright light that reflects off of that really shiny floor that just doesn't feel like home? Is it the endless hallways? Is it the fact that every door looks the same and there's no person in that room? It's just a number in that room. I think that these are maybe existential questions a little bit, but questions that are important to think about. And you might have some of those answers because we're all people that engage with these spaces and that have relationships with these spaces. But your relationship might be different than the relationship of others. It will be different, right? So, for those that are listening that are in this space, I would really encourage you ask people, hey, what's your least favorite thing about a hospital? What is the thing about a hospital that's made you uncomfortable? Those are really important questions to ask. And then you can also ask questions like, what would your dream hospital look like? You can actually invite a few people at a park bench, who knows, draw up some plans together, right? That won't literally be what the hospital looks like, but you'll learn a lot from that. And I think that that will really inject sort of this design strategy, design thinking type of ethos into it all, and would just be really exciting to see.
Yeah, I think what you've really touched on there is the collaboration of design, construction, emotion, patient care, best practice, infection control, all rolled into one, which I think is such a complex beast of health design, which is what everyone loves about it. But to be able to absolutely nail all those needs is what really makes a good health designer. So I 100% agree with your comments.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thanks again for having me too.
That's all right. Thank you, Matthew. It's been great listening to you. I've tremendously enjoyed it. And I absolutely love your passion for health design and also for design thinking, especially what you're doing over there. Your research has been fantastic and certainly helped me with my studies. I hope to listen to you more and also actually read more of your research.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, David. Thanks again for having me, and thanks everyone for listening.
That's all right. Thank you, Matthew, for your time. You have been listening to the Australian Health Design Council podcast series, Health Design on the Go. If you would like to learn more about the AHDC, please connect with us on our website or LinkedIn. Thank you for listening.